The question we'll look at today is, if you want to beat diabetes, but you say, Dennis, a lot of the foods you talk about are unavailable or they're unaffordable. And I just can't do it quite that way. And so we're going to look at that. The whole idea of this video comes from a question that was posed in one of the comments under my videos. This is from a man from Uganda. He says, thank you for reading the comments of listeners around the world. What do you recommend for people living overseas who cannot afford to eat a low-carb, high-fat diet? Could you address that in a video? We live in Uganda, and I know your wife is from Nigeria. How do people in the rural villages follow your advice? Well, that's a great question, but I want to expand it a little beyond that, because there's people in America that just can't afford some of these foods. And sometimes I recommend gadgets that you can buy from Amazon. They're like, well, Dennis, I'm living paycheck to paycheck. I just can't get on Amazon and order something that easily. So I respect that. I recognize that. And we're going to talk about that. Now, if you have unlimited money and you make more money than you even need, you've got plenty of money, then you got no worries about these things. But for the rest of the world, there are concerns. Now, the very first thing I can say is, a lot of times we can afford more than we think we can afford if you compare it with what the alternative is, which is hospital stays, and I can't work because I've got all the kinds of health issues and all of the rest. So sometimes it's better to spend a little more money proactively at the beginning of things while you're still healthy than wait until you're in the hospital and you don't know how you're even going to pay for your hospital stay and the fact that you can't work anymore and so forth. But I wanted to start with an imaginary scenario. Let's imagine that I was on an island. Somehow I got stuck on an island and there was nothing to eat and I couldn't even fish. I didn't have the equipment to fish. But somehow on the island, I find a warehouse that somebody has left behind that apparently was there not so long ago, and it's filled to the top of the roof of that warehouse with ramen instant noodle packages. Now, if you don't know what ramen instant noodles are, they're little small square blocks full of dried up noodles. They're instant noodles. You mix them with boiling water and you have a packet of seasoning you throw in there. You've got almost a meal if you eat 2 or 3 of them. And it's just pure carbs, not a healthy food at all. White flour, pasta, noodles, pure carbs. But I'm on this island. I've got no food at all, no way to hunt, no way to fish, no way to get any food. But I've got a warehouse full of ramen instant noodles. So what do? Well, I'm not going to let myself starve. So while I'm waiting to be rescued, whether it takes a month, 6 months, a year, I'm going to eat those ramen instant noodles. Better that than starving. So I start eating them. Here's the point I want to make about that, though. I can't control my diet. I only have one diet possible, and that's those ramen instant noodle soups. I can't control that. I have no alternatives. But I can control how much of it I eat and how big I allow myself to become. Now, if I'm pretty strict on myself and I don't eat that much per day, I don't know, 2, 3, whatever, packages of these noodles, and I slim down, and by the time I'm rescued a year later, I weigh 150 pounds, I'm much better off than if I say, well, I've got a whole warehouse of these ramen instant noodles packages. I'm just going to really pig out. It's going to be 4 of those babies for breakfast, 6 of them for lunch, and a dozen for supper. And I'm just going to stuff myself because I can fill myself up for years on all these ramen instant noodles that are in that warehouse. And so by the time they rescue me a year later, under that situation, I weigh close to 300 pounds. So one Dennis who's very strict on himself and very much limits how many noodles he'll eat. He wants to live. He doesn't want to die. So he's not going to eat nothing. He'll eat the noodles, but he won't eat that many. So one dentist gets rescued at 150, but under the other scenario, He gets rescued and he weighs almost 300 pounds. Let me ask you, which dentist would be most likely to have severe diabetes? Which one would have the most trouble controlling his glucose? Well, you and I both know the answer to that. It would be the 300-pound dentist, not the 150-pound. Now, you can still be diabetic and be slim. I'm not saying you can't, but you make things much worse on yourself when you are heavy. So what does that have to do with this subject of what if it's unavailable, the keto foods are unavailable or unobtainable, unaffordable? What it has is this. In some cases, in some of the poor nations where they just don't have much at all, and I know because I've been to these nations in Africa and some other places, in some cases, people are big. Some of these folks in some of these nations are much heavier than some Americans. Not always, but some are. So if I am in some village in Africa and I say, I've got a smartphone, I can watch Dennis on Beat Diabetes, and I'm learning up some things. I'm learning about carbohydrates are not really your friend. You don't want to eat too much of those. I'm learning that you better lay off the bread, the pasta, the beans, the potatoes, the cereal, the rice, and so forth. But I just don't have much that I can afford or I can get. One thing I can do, I can control, is how big or not so big I make of myself, and that I can do by portion control. I know there are some people that are so much into the carbs stimulate the insulin, and that makes you big, and they don't even want to hear that portion control is an issue. But friends, let's just be honest. Portion control does make a difference. I mean, even for me that eats quite a low-carb diet, if I let myself eat too much, I'll get bigger, and if I don't eat as much, I'll get smaller. And my scale will tell me that. So there's nobody going to convince me that portion control is irrelevant. So if I'm an African living in a village and I just don't have a lot of choices, I don't have much money, I don't have much availability for keto foods, I couldn't even think about buying almond flour or psyllium husk or xanthan gum or a lot of these things. Even coconut flour is going to be difficult for me to get. One thing I can do, I can have a 150-pound version of Dennis rather than a 250-pound version or a 300-pound version of Dennis. That all by itself is going to make a huge difference in beating diabetes and keeping glucose under control. So start there. Determine if you're serious about this, you're not just asking a question for no reason. You really, really want to beat diabetes. You don't want to go out of this life diabetic. You don't want them to write on your death certificate, he died or she died of diabetic-related complications. You want to go out of this life without diabetic issues, then start wherever you are, whether Uganda, Nigeria, Kenya, China, India, Australia, England, America, Mexico, wherever you are, start by determining you will be the smaller version of you, not the bigger version. You will not need as much insulin. Insulin demands go up double, triple, quadruple, and more when you're heavy than they are when you're not so heavy. So that's a starting point. You may not be able to control everything. You may not be able to afford to make too many changes in your diet. One thing you can do is be a little slimmer. Second, meat is kind of like the freebie as long as it's not got a breaded coating. So if you can find any kind of cheap meat and you're not a vegetarian, then there you go for a starter. Buy cheap meat. Cheap meat is better than expensive carbs or any other kind of carbs. Now, some of you say, I am so poor, I can't even afford meat at all. And hey, in America, it's getting that way. Some of the steaks are outrageous. But there are other alternatives. But if you can afford meat at all and you can buy some cheap meat, whether it's hamburger or whatever, that'll be something that'll help fill you up without raising your blood sugar that much. Another thing to know if you're in this situation is that beans are superior, vastly superior to things like bread and rice and potatoes. They have more fiber. They break down much more slowly in your body, in your stomach. Beans aren't perfect. And I don't really exactly feel comfortable eating a lot of beans. I eat them rarely, but they're sure a whole lot better than a chunk of bread or a big bowl of rice. So if you have to eat beans, far better eating beans than other things, many of the other carbs. Make sure, however, that you eat the beans more in a soup than you would just pure beans. That way you make a nice soup and you throw in some vegetables. I'm tempted to say broccoli. I don't know that Africans eat broccoli much, but you guys know what vegetables are. One of the things in Nigeria they eat all the time is vegetable soup, and they put greens in it. You can put in greens. You can put in low-carb vegetables of different kinds. You can put in mushrooms. You can put in all kinds of things. So if you've got a bowl a certain size and it's pure beans, that's a lot more carbs than if you had that bowl that's got a bean soup, but you've thrown in a lot of low-carb vegetables in there and thrown in some greens, some spinach, cauliflower, broccoli, whatever you can get your hands on, mushrooms. There's a lot you can put in there so that your bowl is not just 100% beans. That will help. So you may need to live on a lot of beans. You know, Ezekiel did it, so it can be done, but beans are not ideal. Okay, from my experience in Africa, greens are everywhere, and they are essentially next to no carbs. What carbs they do have, they dissolve slowly. They don't affect your blood sugar much. So become a greens eater. Eat greens. And every nation may have a different name for their greens and may have different greens, but we all have greens of some kind. So you can take some greens and throw in some beans and make a nice soup. And it's not going to affect blood sugar nearly so much as if you're eating yams and you're eating a starchy fufu, or they have different words for it, but you don't want that. Another thing is nuts and seeds. And I want to just mention a guy that probably some of you that are watching me right now, you don't care for too much. He's almost a vegan. I say almost a vegan. I don't know what he is in his personal diet. He does allow in his book that you can eat some lean meat, which to me is not the best thing to say, because fat meat in my book is better than lean meat. But anyway, he makes much more sense than a lot of the vegans and vegetarians. I want to just read a couple of quotes from him. And to me, if you're going to eat a vegetarian diet, this guy, Joel Fuhrman, his book is called The End of Diabetes, the one that I have read, and I marked it up pretty good. Although I don't agree with him on everything, but I like him a whole lot better than some of these vegans and vegetarians. Anyway, he says he recommends a diet based on, and here he lists them, greens, beans, mushrooms, onions, tomatoes, peppers, berries, intact grains. He says not just whole grains, but intact grains, which if you're going to eat grains at all, that's the best way. But to me, he could have done away with that idea. Seeds and nuts. But greens, beans, mushrooms, onions, tomatoes, peppers, berries, intact grains, or skip that, is what I would do, seeds and nuts. So I know from my time in Africa that you guys have nuts in Africa, and I've eaten them, and we bought them along the road. Little children, 10-year-old kids will come up to your car with a little package of peanuts or different nuts. And so Africans can have nuts, and nuts aren't perfect, but they're a whole lot better than rice and bread and potatoes and yams and so many of the other carbs that are being consumed. Eggs, well, eggs are a perfect food, but they may not be affordable. Boy, they've sure gone up in America. For a while, I was paying, I hate to admit it, but I was paying $8 for like 18 eggs. And then a while back, I went to the grocery store and I saw they were now $4. So it had been cut in half, which is still high compared to what it used to be, but it was a whole lot better. So if you can afford eggs, if you can't, maybe you can raise your own chickens. Maybe not a dozen or 100, but, a couple of chickens and get your own fresh eggs. Eating real foods will help. Don't eat that processed junk. And I know Africans have it. They have all these little shops along the market streets. And you can go in there and buy all kinds of little processed packaged foods, a lot of them with white flour, a lot of them with sugar. Stay away from that stuff. If you're going to have to eat fruit, and let's say you're eating a banana, go for a green banana over a yellow one. It'll have about half the sugar to it, half the carbs. If you're going to eat an apple, go for a small tart apple, not a big sweet apple. So those are choices you can make. If you can at all do it, I'd just say avoid fruit altogether. But if you say, well, I'm going to my cousin's house and he's going to have fruit he's going to expect me to eat, well, find the smallest apple you can find, the greenest banana you can find. There is one thing that we all have in common, whether you're African, Hispanic, Asian, whatever. We all have this in common. If you're going to beat diabetes, you're going to have to go against the prevailing winds of your culture. You can't eat like everybody else. You can't eat like you used to. You're going to have to make change. Now, if you were my congregation and I was preaching, I'd say, everybody say change, and they'd all say change. And I'm going to say, you have to change. Well, let me just say it to my YouTube congregation. Everybody say change. Right where you are, say change. And you will have to change.